Good morning. Thank you for having me today. It is an honor to be here, Kevin. Thank you for that very generous introduction. Thank you to everyone who helped plan today's event. Anytime that a discussion around diversity includes a discussion about people with disabilities, I think it is a very, very good thing because it isn't often the case that when people think of diversity, one of the things that they think of is disability. And that is changing, and it's because of conversations like this, and so it is really an honor to be here with you all today. I really want to make this as interactive as possible. An hour is a really long time to keep all of your attention, I think, but everyone looks like they have coffee. I have my coffee as well, so I'm gonna be making use of that to keep my ADHD under control while I'm up here. I think about a half hour in, you'll be seeing me start to chug the coffee. There's a couple of things that I really want to talk about today, but it boils down to a few things. One, the future needs everyone, including people with disabilities. That is really one of the key points that I hope to drive home in the discussion that we have today. Oftentimes, and a lot of folks here know, you all are doing great work in your own right, each of you, to make the world a better place. And I feel like this is a group of people that knows that the future needs everybody. And oftentimes, people with disabilities aren't included in that equation. Whether you're talking about someone young, right, who has a disability since birth, or someone who comes into disability at some point in their lives, returning veterans from Iraq or Afghanistan, oftentimes, right, the future doesn't include people with disabilities, and it needs to. There is too much at stake for the nation, for the world, to leave anyone sitting on the sidelines. The second thing is that the time is now. We've been talking about a lot of issues for a long time, many of which I will get into today, and if we're still talking about the same issues in 20 years, right, like, I haven't done my job at all, right? We have to really look hard at some of the things, some of the solutions that are out there to make the world more accessible for people with disabilities, the programs that really offer the long-term services and supports, the programs that help get people from, SSDI or Medicaid and into employment, and figure out how we actually approach that so that we actually have really positive outcomes for people with disabilities, many of whom are qualified, who want to work, want to pay taxes, want to contribute, but are often prevented from doing that for a whole host of reasons. And lastly, talking with you all, right, and being here at the School of Social Work, you have the power to help make this change possible, right? The future needs everyone, and you are part of that future. And so in all of your work, I don't know how many people do direct work with folks with disabilities, but I would imagine in some way we all do. We need to raise expectations. We need to really shed the past and the preconceived notions that sort of come along with people with disabilities, and move to a place where we acknowledge that people with disabilities have the same opportunities, the same ability to succeed and fail on their own right. And that is what this is all about. That's what AAPD is all about. So Kevin mentioned that we are the largest disability rights organization in the nation. We fight for those four tenets that he mentioned, right, which is equal opportunity, economic power, political participation, and independent living. And I'll get into a little bit of each of those as we talk this morning. But I want to actually start with a story about BC. So 20 years ago this year, actually, I graduated from Chelmsford High School right here in Massachusetts. And so, right, applied to many, many different schools. One of them was Boston College. I actually was fortunate enough to get in, but Brandeis University over in Waltham actually decided they wanted to give me a lot more of financial support, and so that's where I ended up. But quite frankly, this was my first choice. I think culturally it was the place that I wanted to be, and it was just such an outstanding institution. But high school kid, right, 18 years old. I can't pay for my own school, and so they made an attractive offer, and so I went to Waltham instead. And it is funny what sort of life, the path that life sort of puts people on, right? So I go to Brandeis, and you know what? I probably should have came to BC because 2 years in, I was like, you know what? This isn't the right place for me. And so much to my parents' chagrin, I dropped out of school. And a friend and I decided we were going to go to Tahoe and ski, right? This was the master plan, Tahoe and skiing. And so we packed up my beat-up Plymouth Horizon. It was early summer, had ski racks on the top, sort of did a zigzag around the country, got to Tahoe, and it was towards the end of the summer. I actually think it was in September. Some friends and I were going to go and do some cliff diving, right? And so it's this little mountain lake outside of Tahoe, rickety mountain dirt road, very difficult to get to. Once you get to the lake, you actually had to walk all the way around the lake, you know, climbing over boulders and what have you, to get to this cliff where everyone dives. And so we get there. None of us had actually jumped off of this cliff before, right? We had none of us. So I look, and as Kevin mentioned, right, I'm blind in one eye. I have no depth perception whatsoever. So I'm thinking, oh, it's like just a few feet, right? And so I go first. Well, I don't know how many people here have jumped off a really big cliff, right? Like 60 feet or more, right? Well, you jump off and you don't hit the water right away, right? You're like, where is the water, right? Like I could just go through the whole entire alphabet and count to 100 and I'm still plummeting, right? And so I hit the water the wrong way. And so I didn't actually hit the bottom, but I was sort of in a seated position, and I fractured my L1 vertebra, right? And the reason I tell this story, right, is that this is not my disability story, right? It isn't, but it is the start of many, many people's disability story. And so disability, right, is something that anyone can come into at any point in life. And so it's not my story, but there are a lot of common things, right, that people with disabilities share that we don't often talk about. So one of the things that we do talk about a lot is no pity, right? Back in the 80s, right, Jerry Lewis telethons, people were sort of paraded out in front of the world so folks could raise money. And, there was a really, really visceral reaction against that, which is absolutely appropriate. And a piece of that includes no pity. But sometimes no pity is taken to an extreme where we don't end up talking about the shared experience that we all have. It's just a fundamental human part of the experience, right? So when I was young, about 3 or 4, I can remember I was in the backyard with my friend Julie and saying, Julie, do you ever notice that it's darker on one side than the other? She was like, I think it's the clouds. And I remember asking my mom in the kitchen, Mom, it's darker on one side than the other, right? And how is this adult supposed to process this information, right? What is my kid talking about? And it wasn't until some time later, and I'm not exactly sure whether it was 3 months or a month or a week or a year. I was with my mom. We were coming home from the grocery store, sitting in the back seat in my car, the little kid seat, and she turns around to unbuckle me after we pull into the driveway. And she's like, Mark, look at me. I am looking at you. No, Mark, really, look at me. I'm looking at you. Stop joking around. Look at me. I am. The look of horror that came across her face when she realized that I thought my gaze was in her direction, but it was actually, probably off to the right or the left or what have you. I wasn't focused on her. Will stay with me for the rest of my life, right? And that is a common piece of the disability experience, right? It's the fear, right, of being a 3-year-old kid and being like, what's going on, right? Like, my whole world seems like upside down at the moment. The reaction of loved ones, right, who don't know what to do, right? You know, someone's in an accident or they have a newborn child who has a disability, and the fear and the disappointment. You know, people want the best for everyone. And when, you know, whether, right, I'm trying to, like Rick Santorum, right? He spoke at the Republican convention in August. He likes to talk about his daughter quite a bit. You know, in his speech, right? He said, when she was born, I held her hand, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, and I knew that something was wrong. So her whole life, right? Something's wrong, right? And that is a powerful thing, right? No matter what your disability, if the whole world around you thinks that there's something wrong, something that needs to be fixed. But that's a very common piece of the experience, right? So get diagnosed as being blind in my right eye. And the reason was toxoplasmosis, which is a disease that cats carry. And what's the first thing everyone does want to do? They want to fix it. So I did several operations, mass eye and ear. They were unsuccessful. Also common to the experience, though, I went to some faith healers. It didn't work, right? There were some priests actually in the Boston area that we went to on several occasions. And that was a really powerful experience as well, right? And so I had loved ones, I had people that I cared for and cared for me, telling me that I need to be fixed, right? I had, you know, really, and this is probably going to be fairly controversial in this room, right? Religion saying that God wanted me to be fixed, and then leaving that experience, right? Thinking, well, maybe I didn't do something right? I didn't pray hard enough. I didn't, you know, I wasn't worthy for some reason. And right, that's a really common piece of the experience as well. Actually, yesterday I was with former Congressman Tony Coelho up on Capitol Hill. And he was telling his story. He has epilepsy. And when he was young, same reaction from his family. You know, he wanted to, you know, actually go into the priesthood. And at the time, he couldn't do that because he had epilepsy. He didn't realize, though, that he did until he actually went for the physical that was required to get into the seminary. That's when they first sort of said, hey, has anyone ever told you that you have epilepsy? So he calls his parents. He's like, guess what? All those, you know, fainting spells I've been having, there's a name for it. It's called epilepsy. Well, their reaction, no son of mine has epilepsy, right? And they didn't talk for about 25 years. But leading up to that, actually, which I skipped, right? Lots of faith healers, right? Lots of how do we help our son through this? And it's tough, right? Because there are health issues. There are legitimate health issues that need to be addressed, but there is also the human being, right? And how do we define what it means to be a whole person? And how does that specifically relate to disability is a very, very important thing. You know, I work every day with really, really brilliant people, but many of whom would never have a shot at employment because of preconceived notions, because of stereotypes around what it means to be a person with a disability. And that's what we are fighting to change. And the experience, it is very common, right? No matter whether you have a visual disability, whether you are deaf or hard of hearing, you have a spinal cord injury, you know, there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of fear. But you know what? I feel like when we talk about that, that makes us so much stronger. It makes us so much stronger when we acknowledge that piece of our experience, and when we acknowledge it with each other as a community, right? It is not something that is atypical. But the experience can be very, very isolating. But all of that is changing. It really is changing for so many reasons, one of which, right, the ADA, IDEA, you know, more and more people with disabilities are leaving school with all the same expectations and hopes and dreams for the future that other folks, other able-bodied students, really see for themselves. And that is a powerful thing. And it is transforming the entire disability rights movement in an absolutely amazing way. And so the other thing, actually, I should mention, right, because I think it's important before I move on, right, is I do have another disability, ADHD. And that might be something that a lot of you encounter in your work as well. And it's interesting, there you go again, right? I think a lot of people think, he just doesn't try hard enough, right? He just doesn't pay attention. He's just spaced out. Well, it's sort of fascinating to me, actually, to sort of look back. I wasn't actually diagnosed with ADHD until adulthood. And, right, I remember being in school. I did actually go back to school. Maybe I should have mentioned that. I went to Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. It was a wonderful, wonderful spot. Right, looking back, I just thought I was really smart because, I didn't read any of the books, and I'd study right before the test and, blow everyone out of the water with my grades and, gaming the system, right? But now sort of knowing that I have ADHD and the symptoms of that, and it totally could have transformed that educational experience had I known at a younger age. And even today, right, it's not sort of what people think. It's not that, oh, he doesn't pay attention. Oh, he needs to focus and read more, right? When the emails come in, by the way, I get about like 3,000 emails a week. Right, your eyes glaze over and you get anxious, and then someone walks in the door and they're like, oh, Mark, I need this. And right, the whole world is just sort of a mess. But right, that's part of my disability. And actually, when I really think about it, it's part of what makes me strong, right, is that somehow it ends up all working together, so that I can really sort of move forward, function, and do all the things that everyone else does, even though, right, they read that book and they probably remember it for, the rest of their lives. And so, right, but the thing is, it doesn't matter what the disability, right? You can go on to work at the White House. You can go on to run a big national organization. You can overcome a lot. And really, it's just because, right, we're just like everyone else. And so I want to get a little bit into the history, right? So when you look at the history of the movement, and where we've been and where we're going, it's a long history, and we have come a long way. And so, you can look back to, 100 years ago, right, where the really only options for people were, quite frankly, right, and this is stereotypical, join the carnival, right, stay at home, and it was tough, right, lots of institutionalization, and lots of forced institutionalization, and it went on for a long, long time. And it really didn't start to change until sort of the late 60s, 70s, or mid-60s, when people came together and started to institute some new things, right? So there was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Medicaid came into being. Lots of different programs came to be that really supported the lives of people with disabilities. But a lot of it came about because people sort of had that pity feeling, right? Because we want to help, right? We want to make the world a better place for people with disabilities, and they need something from us, right? As a community, as a nation, in order to live independent lives. As time went on, people did become more independent, right? And then as the 80s go on, right, bypassing a lot of the details here, we have the ADA that came into being in 1990, right? And that was a really amazing thing that happened there, because the community came together in a way that it hadn't before to organize, to get this legislation through. There were amazing leaders like Tony Coelho, Justin Dart, Paul Hearn, who was one of the founders of AAPD, the list goes on. And they all came together and said, this is what we need. And there were bus tours across the country. There was a really energized grassroots base. And it was really, in many ways, the foundation of the modern disability rights movement. And it was successful, right? So the ADA got passed. But the infrastructure that sort of happened around that and the cross-disability infrastructure didn't necessarily last with it. So while there was progress, while there was movement, it was a little bit more fractured as a community. A few years after that, 1995 was actually when the American Association of People with Disabilities was founded. And so we have gone on for 17 years, and there are a lot of other organizations founded a little bit before us, a little bit after us, that have been doing great work. But the ADA transformed a lot. Didn't transform everything, but it transformed a lot. Right, and so you could, if you were a chair user, go through the city, walk through the city, and not face a 6-inch curb that might as well have been the Berlin Wall, right? Because you couldn't get over it, right? You couldn't, stories about folks, right, who couldn't go to court, right? The courthouse wasn't accessible. There were steps, and being punished for that. Right? Being punished because you couldn't show up to your day in court, but the court had like 4 or 5 steps, right? And you're a chair user, and how are you supposed to get up there? And the ADA transformed that. There's actually a gentleman who is on AAPD's board. His name is Fred Moss. He is an executive at Comcast. And he was telling the story about how when he was first starting out in his career, I actually won't give a date, just in case he doesn't want me to, small law firm, 2 stories, they put him on the 2nd floor. So every morning when he came in, people had to lift him up, carry him up the stairs, get him to his desk. If he needed to use the facilities, they were on the 1st floor, right? There was a fire, right? These are the things that the ADA changed, right? Fred is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And so, right, when we talk about equal opportunity, getting rid of those stairs, that's equal opportunity. And there's still a long way to go in that front. But those are the types of things that the ADA really, really changed. It also brought some definition to disability in many ways, which was very important in terms of legal status and all of that. And it really allowed the community, I think, even though I felt we really sort of dispersed in terms of the organization, it really was an important organizing tool, right? Because we could talk about it in a way that was really important. The Rehab Act also has some definitions as well. And it was a really, really powerful, transformative thing. The 25th anniversary is actually coming up in 2015, and I think that's going to be a pretty exciting time. And one of the things that is fascinating about this point in history is that you have people who were born, right, after the ADA became law and have lived under the ADA and have really different expectations for the future. And that is one of the things I think is going to be so transformative for the community. Young people, quite frankly, aren't willing to put up with a lot of the stuff that the older generation was willing to put up with. They have higher expectations. They have a sense of their own future, what they can accomplish. And so it's really, really fascinating to see. And so, the history has been tough. And one of the things that's interesting, though, when I think about the history is sort of taking that discussion from one where it's, people with disabilities, people who need services, people who need help, to a discussion that's about civil rights, right? And so a lot of times people, I think, don't think of disability rights as a civil right discussion, but it is. It absolutely is. There is no way around it. We are fighting for equality, plain and simple. But it sometimes gets lost in discussions about Medicaid waivers, right? SSDI and Ticket to Work. And, actually, congratulations to folks. Maybe you're sitting in this room. I heard on the way over here that a law just changed where people who have IQs of 70 are no longer disqualified immediately for some of the state services. And so that's pretty outstanding. But right, the word equality sort of gets lost in discussions like this. And that is what we're fighting for, right? The younger generation, I'll put myself in the younger generation, right? Right, that's what it's about. It's about equality, right? plain and simple, right? It's not about services, right? It's not about things we need, right? And when these programs were established a long time ago, right, there was different technology, there were different expectations, right? If you were blind or deaf, a lot of times, people didn't think you could work. Unfortunately, quite frankly, a lot of times people still don't think you can work. But the expectation of the individual is very, very different. And I think that is going to really power the future of disability rights in a really outstanding way. And it's going to be transformative. And so, when we fight to protect important programs like Medicaid or SSDI, how many people really think in this day and age, right, that someone who is deaf or someone who is blind can't participate fully in the workforce, right? Why not? Why not? Right? There's absolutely no reason why not. We have the technology, right? We know better, right? We know that, right? A lot of times people sort of equate any disability with an intellectual disability. It's amazing. I will be at lunch or dinner with a colleague or friend, maybe a chair user, or maybe someone who's blind. The number of times the wait staff will not address that person is mortifying. It happens all the time. What does he want? Why don't you ask him, right? But that's why this is a civil rights discussion, right? Because, right, you go to the restaurant, you want service, right? From my mind, right, Kevin alluded to my background in LGBT rights, right? Imagine if a restaurant said, well, A, we're not going to talk to you because you're gay, or B, maybe they have stairs going into the restaurant or stairs to the restroom, right? So let's just substitute disability for gay, or substitute gay for disability for a second, right? So there's 3 steps up into the restaurant, which could be the case, right? 20 plus years after the ADA, because there are a lot of folks who are grandfathered in. So we don't want you to come because you have a disability. People with disabilities aren't welcome here. Imagine if it was people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender aren't welcome here, right? Or people who are African American aren't welcome here. Well, that's basically what that staircase says, right? We don't want you. We don't want your business. We don't think you should be here. And that's the type of thing that is changing, right? It is unacceptable to me that a whole entire piece of the American citizenry is not invited to go into restaurants, right? The impact that has on social lives, right? The impact that has on people's ability to do business. It is a struggle in this day and age to actually find accessible places. I would imagine Boston is particularly difficult given how old most of the structures are. A couple of weeks, I guess it was October, one of the things we run at AAPD is Disability Mentoring Day. And we actually last year had about 16,500 young people, high school age, participate. And basically it's a day of job shadowing where they go into businesses, learn the ins and outs of the workplace. And so our kickoff was in New York. So my assistant, he's charged with finding a hotel for us, right? And we have this laundry list of things that we have to ask, right? You can't just go to Orbitz or Travelocity and book your hotel, right? Because you have to ask questions about accessibility. And it's a pretty extensive list. But one of the things we didn't think to ask was about the front door. So we get there. One of the folks that works at AAPD is a chair user. And she was actually coming a little bit behind me. And so I get there, and I'm like, where's the accessible entrance? And they're like, oh, this is the accessible entrance. It is? Yeah, we have a ramp that we could install, temporarily. Are you kidding me? Right? So if we're talking about equality, right? A piece of that means that Dana doesn't have to ask anyone for help to get into that building, right? And there's no reason for it. And so they are actually very nice, and we changed hotels. We went to a Marriott, right, a little bit more modern, and it worked out in that sense, right? But who thinks they need to ask? I guess maybe we should have, right? Is the front entrance accessible? And in their mind, it was, right? And quite frankly, according to the ADA, probably they're all right, by law. But not in terms of if the definition is equality. If that is the definition, if that is what it means, and that is what we're fighting for, then it doesn't matter what the ADA says, right? The ADA is a floor. It is a floor. It is not the ceiling. And we need to shoot for that ceiling and move forward. And so, the challenge, right, is it's that, even people who want to do the right thing sometimes don't even know how to, right? And so, one of the things that has happened over the last year since I've had this job, and I was involved in the disability community in many ways. I helped found Disability PAC, which was the first ever federal political action committee. But I've really come to know it in a very different way, right? And so my 9 to 5, right, was fighting for LGBT equality before I went into the White House. And now my 9 to 5, and really it's 8 to, I don't know, I was still working at 4 in the morning, right? It's about disability. And I have come to really understand the meaning of the word oppression in a way that I just did not know before. And so I'll tell a story about, a young woman who happened to be deaf. Absolutely outstanding, grades through the roof in undergrad, one of the best people who actually had ever worked for me. She just knocked it out of the park. She was a go-getter. She was brilliant, literally just one of the brightest up-and-comers I had ever had the pleasure to work for. And she was interested in going to work for another friend of mine. And I'm going to change all of the names to protect both the guilty and the innocent. And so she wants to go work for this other friend of mine. And I was like, you know what? Give me your resume. It was a fellowship. I was sad to see her go, but part of helping young people is you have to help them to the next step as much as you might want to keep them working for you forever. And so resume goes off to my friend. Crickets. Nothing. I call. Hey, Joe, right? What do you think? Well, let me get back to you. All right, we'll look. More crickets. Joe, right? A couple weeks later, what do you think, right? She's brilliant. You should come have her in for an interview. Well, and I really think the world of Joe, by the way, right? Joe is always trying to do the right thing. We can't do that, Mark. What? Well, it's going to cost money for, accommodations. We have a really fast-paced office environment. We work long hours. Can she work long hours? What? Right? What does working long hours, what does stamina have to do with whether you're deaf or hard of hearing? Absolutely nothing, right? And the cost of accommodations, I actually said I would write the check, but, they aren't that expensive. They aren't that expensive overall. But the challenge is, when you think of the workplace, if you aren't used to working with someone with a disability, you don't necessarily know how to. And so one of the things that we really look to do at AAPD, and I can get into some more detail, is help companies sort of really understand how to make the workplace really accessible and accommodating for people with disabilities. And so, all right, Mark, we'll bring her in for an interview. So she comes up to me 2 days later. Mark, I got an interview. I'm really excited. Awesome. But they aren't going to hire an interpreter. They have someone on staff who can sign. Well, that's like me saying I took French in college and, I could interpret for someone from Paris, right? There's a big difference between a professional interpreter and someone who can sign. But sometimes people who can sign are brilliant. And so I was like, see how it goes. Maybe this kid is brilliant. And the interview will go well, and you can make the change from the inside. Well, she and I both knew better, right? So the interview goes horribly, absolutely horribly, right? He can't sign very well. They end up passing notes back and forth. I get a call. So, from Joe, right? Mark, we brought her in for the interview. I heard. Right? Well, it didn't go very well, so we're not going to be able to hire her. Actually, right? So you didn't do this right? Like you needed to bring in an interpreter, a professional interpreter, right? You needed to give her the opportunity that you would give any other applicant, and that didn't happen. And so I really, really pushed, right? And so the questions come up again, right? So people are worried about X, Y, and Z, right? The long hours, right? How are we going to communicate with her in an office environment? And we walk through them, right? They bring her in for a second interview with a professional interpreter. And she knocks it out of the park. And ends up getting the job. And so actually, right, I don't know, maybe she didn't knock it out of the park. Maybe Joe was just like, I need to get Mark off my back here. But the evidence, actually, is that since she has had that job, she has already been promoted twice in a very, very short period, because she is brilliant, because she is capable, and she is capable of doing and succeeding just like anyone else. But you have folks like Joe, who, by the way, is like probably one of the most progressive guys out there, right? Who actually does a lot of work for people with disabilities in general, who couldn't necessarily figure out how to hire one, right? And so 22 years after the ADA, right, a lot has changed. But do you know what? The unemployment rate for people with disabilities has just continued to go up. And there are stories, and when I say up, I mean like 80%, right? Like it's like almost 80% of people with disabilities are part of the long-term unemployed. And when you look at the numbers that DOL puts out every month, we are always, almost twice as much what, the rest of the national average is. And so, but behind all those millions of people is one story, right? One story like the one I just told. And right, so you're talking about brilliant people who can't get jobs, right? So how many folks have I talked to, right, who, quite right, I remember this was particularly tough. I met a guy who broke his back cliff diving, so he had a spinal cord injury. It happened when he was 22. And we were at a conference in DC. And smart guy, college educated, he was unable to get a job for his entire adult life to that point, right? Because really the challenge is, right, when you're in a chair, or if you're blind, or if you're deaf, or you have cerebral palsy or CF or epilepsy, you walk in for that interview, right, and the person doesn't quite know how to deal with it, right? And that's what we need to change. Right? And so that is why we are fighting for full equality, because we need to get the whole entire nation, the whole entire world, to see past that disability, to see the person behind the disability, to see everything they're capable of, to not just assume because you have a disability that it's an intellectual disability, and not to assume if someone has an intellectual disability that they, need to be in a sheltered workshop, sewing buttons on shirts for 2 cents an hour. The expectations need to rise, right? And you all can be a part of that given the work that you do. And the future, right, does need everyone, right? And so, right, my friend, I keep wanting to say her name, which is why I hesitate, because then the names would not be changed to protect the guilty and the innocent, right? She could have been left behind. And do you know what the sad thing is? There might be a time in her life when she is, right? Because, maybe she loses a job for whatever reason. Budget cuts, layoffs. the challenge for someone with a disability to get back into the workforce is 10 times harder, right? Statistically, it's about 10 times harder for people with disabilities once they lose a job to get the job again. And so that is the type of thing that when we talk about disability rights, when we talk about diversity, that's why this is a diversity factor, right? Because there is an entire community of people who want to work, who could work, right, and are still fighting the same old stereotypes that they probably did in high school about short buses, right? And that's what we're trying to move past. And that the future, right, it does include everyone, includes all people with disabilities. And I know, though, that it's changing, right? So those young people, right, that not taking no for an answer, right? Not taking no for an answer. The expectations are high, right? You know, I think that there will be a time, right, in the future when it doesn't matter what restaurant it is, it doesn't matter when the building was built, people can get in, right? And if you look, right, everyone, oh, it costs a lot of money. Tons, right? Where are people going to get the money? I have some ideas, actually. So, you know, one of the big differences actually between the disability civil rights movement and other civil rights movement is the cost factor, right? At least that is what people think, right? So when I was working at the Human Rights Campaign, right, and we wanted to serve in the military or we wanted to end workplace discrimination, those things are sort of free. Accommodations, some of that stuff costs money, right? ADA compliance, some of that does cost a little money. Well, the government has been spending a lot of money for a long time to try and get people with disabilities employed. We partner with the University of New Hampshire each year to release a disability compendium. And this year we just did this in November. Literally, in 2010, the government, and I'm making a generalization, so generalizations are always false, there are some good programs, right, spent $131 billion on employment services for people with disabilities. But the unemployment rate, went up. So in my book, right, what are you doing with all that money, right? Like, so there's money out there, right? And I actually think one of the things that we're going to be doing at AAPD, which I am very, very excited about, is starting to think big, right? You know, it's very, very common in the community and in advocacy groups to want to fight to protect the same old status quo. And it is very, very important that the programs and services that are there for people with disabilities exist. But is there a way that we can reimagine them so that the future, right, which needs everyone, can actually be achieved, right? So in my book, right, there's $131 billion that we could sort of re-envision. Given these economic times, probably it would be very hard for anyone to re-envision anything, but it could be possible. And so we really need to start to think big. And so actually at AAPD, in a couple of weeks, we have a new actually executive vice president joining us who is absolutely outstanding. His name is Henry Claypool. He's currently Kathy Sebelius's disability policy advisor. And that's going to be his task, right? How do we look at healthcare and remove those disincentives, right? And so, right, we talk a lot, right, about the fact that people, once they're on things like programs like SSDI, right, have a very, very difficult time transferring from that very important program into the workforce. A lot of it is because, right, there isn't access to quality health care. There isn't, you know, if you are a young person, right, and you're a chair user, you know, the cost of that chair, right, the cost of catheters, you know, every single month, right, the cost potentially, right, to have someone who can help you from your bed in the morning to that chair so you can go to work, right? That is a huge challenge, especially for young folks. You know, you can't take that $30,000 a year job necessarily because you're going to lose the ability to get out of bed in the morning. And so those are the things that we need to figure out. I don't know if there are easy solutions, but I think there are solutions. And I think that the community is at a point, and I think America is at a point where folks know that there's something better. That if we are spending all of this money, there is a outcome-based option that has to be out there that we can find. And so there are a lot of really good people working on these issues. But the status quo, for anyone that works in government, is a very, very powerful force. And so it's going to be tough. But those are the types of conversations that we're really going to push for, because I really know in my heart, right, folks like my friend and others, right, they actually don't need to be on SSDI. They don't need Medicaid. The only reason they need Medicaid is because they can't get jobs. But they should be able to get jobs because many of them are absolutely qualified to do that. So one of the things that we're actually pushing for is implementation of Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So 40 years later, 39, depending on the time of year, so I guess technically almost 40 years later, right, that section hasn't been enforced, right? And actually, when you look at the ADA, there are tons of pieces of that legislation that haven't been enforced. So what Section 503 would do is it would require federal contractors to set hiring targets for people with disabilities. Federal contractors represent 22% of the American workforce. And this piece of legislation that, right, was passed in a bipartisan manner, it's just languished. So President Obama has actually been working very hard with the Department of Labor to try and implement Section 503, right? And the forces of the status quo are intense, right? If you were to do some research online, right, the business lobby, the human resources councils, no, right, we can't do this, right? They have a whole laundry list, and quite frankly, half of the things that come out of their mouths is shocking because it's a lot of stereotypes. It is a lot of stereotypes about the capability of people with disabilities. And so we're really pushing to make this happen. It is very much David versus Goliath, even though we have the White House on our side. But if we are able to push that through, it will be absolutely transformative. And you know what? The federal government has done this for oppressed communities for a long time. This isn't very, very different. And it's critical because you can't pull the rug out from under people, right? So you can't say, right, we need to cut Medicaid, right, and decimate it, right? So you had that Paul Ryan budget, right, which had, $700 billion in cuts to Medicaid, right? You can't just pull the rug out from under people unless there's something else, right? Unless there's an opportunity for real employment, which I think there can be, right? So I actually agree, right, with the fact that we probably could save $700 billion, right, in future Medicaid spending, but not if there isn't the opportunity for employment. So where we disagree is that I feel like folks should be able to get good paying real jobs versus charity will pick up the slack, right? Because we're not talking about charity anymore, right? This isn't charity work, right? This is about equality. This is about access to the same rights and privileges that all Americans deserve and take for granted. That's what this is about. And I really do see that future happening now. And so one of the things that's really exciting at AAPD is how we're trying to change that, right? So we're going to bring on some new policy team that's really going to try and figure out some solutions to this. But at the same time, we are moving forward on some things. So one of the things that we have stolen from my time in the LGBT community is we're actually going to have a corporate rating system, calling it the Disability Equality Index. We actually stole the gentleman that had led the Corporate Equality Index for the Human Rights Campaign for 15 years to help us build this for us. And so what it will be, and we're actually partnering with this great organization, the United States Business Leadership Network, which is a business-to-business network connecting HR professionals in the disability space. It's 10 questions, 20 questions on whether a company is doing, how a company is doing in terms of disability, hiring practices, accommodations, technology, infrastructure. We actually haven't come up with the list of questions yet. And that, right, that is redefining the paradigm, quite frankly, right, in a really powerful way. It's subtle, right, and we are actually going to be a lot more carrot and a lot less stick than the LGBT community. But what it is the community saying, this is what we expect. This is what a good job means, right? Not job as in employment, but right, like this, if your company is doing right, we're defining it. You don't get to define it anymore. And that doesn't exist. It does not exist. Another thing that we are really looking to do, and actually, by the way, I should say, this is gonna be tough, right? Talk about status quo and people not wanting us to do this. It is, right? You know, the folks out there in the business world are afraid. And I think there are a lot of legitimate questions. And one of the things that is going to be important about this program, right, is we're going to offer a safe space for people to ask the questions, right? Because I know firsthand, I just told you, right, about my friend Joe. He wants to do the right thing, but he doesn't necessarily know how to do the right thing, right? And so if we are all just hammering corporate America, by the way, that's the very same people that we're going to ask for jobs from, right? We're not going to get very far. And so one of the things I'm really excited about is after folks fill out the survey, right, we get the results back. We're actually going to have an extended period of 6 to 8 months where we work with companies to help them improve their rating, right? And it's not about improving the rating, which of course they want to get a good rating, but it's about working with folks, building the relationships with folks so you can have those conversations about what it means to be an inclusive workforce and an inclusive workplace. And that's the powerful piece of it, right? The rating is important maybe, but more important, right, is the dialogue, right, that happens. And so that's a pretty exciting thing. Another thing, and now this is controversial, that I'm hoping to do someday. So, would you believe that if you wanted to find how your member of Congress voted on disability issues, that you couldn't do that right now? There's not a single organization, including mine, that rates members of Congress. And my organization, quite frankly, isn't quite ready, right? And it's fascinating to me. So coming from the LGBT space, we should rate members of Congress, right? It's publicly available information, right? Should be pretty simple. No. Bad mark, yes. Right? The thing that is, right, and this goes to one of the differences between the civil rights movements, is the funding, right? No one wants to make the funder unhappy. Right? And if the funder is the federal government, which by the way, for the most part it is, it's hard to hold those elected officials accountable. And so we'll get there. We will get there. And actually, I think we're going to get beat by the Japanese American Citizens League and my friend Priscilla because, right, one of the things her membership wants, because they're an aging membership, is to know how members of Congress vote on disability issues. And so it's going to happen, right? So whether AAPD does it, or the National Council on Independent Living, or some other organization, maybe even Amerigroup, right? It's changing, right? And that status quo actually can't be stopped, right? Like it's there, right? Because the energy is there, because young people and their engagement, right, aren't willing to be sort of, told, no, we can't do something like that. Right? And so those are the types of challenges, quite frankly, that the movement is facing right now. And it's a paradigm shift. It's a movement, right, from pity, right, where people go to members of Congress and beg and plead for, this and that, to a discussion about what we expect. This is what we expect from you, right? This is what it means to be good by people with disabilities, your constituents with disabilities. And that, right? Telling corporate America what it means to be good by people with disabilities, telling members of Congress, defining that. It's a very, very different thing. And it's exciting because I really think for a whole host of reasons, really, right, education, I didn't talk much about education. It has transformed. It isn't perfect, but, integration, not putting everyone in some classroom down the hall, regardless of whether you have Down syndrome or cystic fibrosis, that's changed, right? And so those expectations of young people have changed, and it is going to drive a whole entire, with technology, movement forward. And so when I talk about sort of knowing the meaning of an oppression in a way that I didn't know it before, I'm at a world of folks, right, who want nothing more than to be a part of society, and an entire society who doesn't even know or doesn't even have the vocabulary, to even talk about it in terms of a civil right. Right? Like, that's what we need to change, because the future needs everyone, right? And the time for it to change is now, right? It's not 20 years from now. There's no reason for it to be 20 years from now. Maybe in the 80s it needed to be 20 years from now, but times have changed. Expectations have changed. Technology has changed. And I know that it's going to happen. I really, really feel strongly about that. And let me see. So, I could go on. Actually, I remember saying to Kevin before I got up here that an hour, how on earth can I do an hour? And I'm still going. So, one of the things, and this will be sort of the parting note, that we are doing at AAPD really is trying to transform how the world sees people with disabilities, perceives people with disabilities. I would actually encourage you all after this to go to www.aapd.com, and I'm not /30 seconds. And actually, I wish that I had thought of this sooner. But yes, sometimes there are pitfalls to ADHD. There's a really powerful commercial that we are running with Comcast. It's actually run to the tune of almost $6 million over the past year and a half, and it's about bullying. And it is these 3 young people, and they are looking at the camera, and I am not going to be bullied. And it is powerful, right? Because it's these 3 brilliant, young, inspiring folks, and they aren't asking for permission. They don't even really talk about their disability. They say things like, right, I'm going to be valedictorian. I'm a football fan, right? And I'm not going to be bullied. And in that message, that is so important for young people, sort of the entire message that the community has for the world right now. Because the future needs everyone. We're done waiting. The time is now. But we can't do it alone. We can only do it with folks like you all helping. And, it was interesting. After I left the White House, I actually had the occasion to go back into the White House in a meeting with the Roosevelt Room with some of the president's senior advisors. And I brought a couple of leaders from the disability space with me. It was sort of an introductory meeting. We actually did a little scolding of my former employers. And I remember the leaders, one of them particularly, was in tears talking about some of this stuff. And, looking back, 10 years in my past, right, in similar meetings that I would be in with leaders in the LGBT community, and there was passion with the LGBT leaders, and there was drive, and there was righteousness. But I never saw anyone cry in a meeting at the White House, right? And I made a lot of judgments about why they were, right? And they were all wrong. It's because you look across the table and you don't necessarily know if people get it. You don't know, right, if the world understands that the only thing we want is equality, to be treated like everyone else, right? That this isn't about Medicaid or Social Security disability insurance or, this or that. This is about human beings, right? And does the person on the other side of the table understand that I'm not here to fight for money. I'm not here to fight for some program. I'm here because, right, we're Americans, and we're people, and we're just like everyone else. And that's what we're shooting for. So it really has been an honor to be with you all this morning. I could go on for another hour, I think, but I'll hand it over to Kevin. Thank you.
I'm sure many of you are dying to ask Mark some questions, and we actually have some time to do that.
No questions.
I'll start, but it's just to get you going. You know, in the human rights campaign, arguably it was very important for gay, lesbian people to get to the point they could identify, you know, as being gay. Is that something, is it a similar approach that may be important in the disability side for people to be able to be comfortable saying, I have a disability?
That is a very good question, because I do think, right, so one of the things I really like to do, because I'm sort of a geek that way, is study other civil rights movements, and actually beyond even the LGBT community, I spend a lot of time with leaders in other movements, like Priscilla, who is now running the Japanese American Citizens League, and others. And, right, in the LGBT space, right, though, a lot of people came out of the closet, right, at a certain point. And a lot of people, more and more people, started to identify. And all of the studies showed that if you knew someone who was LGBT, you were much more likely to be supportive. I do think that the same thing could happen in the disability space. And I think I'm actually a really good example, right? So, right, blind in one eye, ADHD. But I didn't really necessarily think of myself as a person with a disability. And so it's a little bit more complex, perhaps, but not too much more complex, only in the sense that you have a lot of folks with invisible disabilities who don't necessarily have to tell anyone, right? You know, whether it's a psychiatric or neurological disability, some other hidden disability. You have folks who have physical disabilities, but who don't necessarily identify either. And so I actually remember talking to a young woman who had cerebral palsy. And, right, she didn't know that she had cerebral palsy until she was about 11. I think the world just sort of assumed she knew that she was somehow different. But they were watching a home video of her and her brothers like running across a field or a playground. And she realized that she didn't move the same way as everyone else. And that was the first time in her entire life that she realized that she was different. And so, right, talking about it is key. And then there's another group as well, which is folks who have, right, like my nephew who has cystic fibrosis. Right, he has cystic fibrosis, right? Does he think of himself as a person with a disability? I don't know, but I don't necessarily know that he has to. You know, I think that we all share that common experience, and whether we want to put that disability label on ourselves or not is somewhat irrelevant as long as we sort of own that disability. But one of the things that is really interesting is I think we already have the language for it, right? So actually I'm in a lot of conversations with people sort of brainstorming about the future, and right, there are a lot of conversations. We need more people to come out, but we can't use come out because the gays already have that, right? And so we have a word. We use it all the time, but in one context, in the employment context, and it's disclosure. Right? So disclosure is a really common word that we use all the time for disability, and I think it's our word, right? And I think we take it out of the employment context and we start to talk about it, and I actually think we should invest in disclosing, right? You know, so if you look at the LGBT community, they spent money on getting people to come out, right? They invested in it. There's the National Coming Out Day project, right? They even got a day named after it. You know, right? So I think that there are some parallels there that we could borrow.
I was curious in all of your experiences how you think the United States compares to other countries in dealing with people with disabilities and accommodating them in the workplace.
So I haven't not traveled everywhere, right? So I don't want to speak entirely out of school, but my impression, right, is that we are far ahead, right? So the ADA, quite frankly, was the first of its kind thing throughout the world, and it really is the goal post that a lot of other countries aim for. More and more countries, are moving in the right direction. But by and large, the states tend to be a pretty good place. But in my book, we still need to keep moving the ball forward. And so, there's actually there's a treaty in the United States Senate right now. And actually, if you come to my workshop, that's what we're going to be talking a lot about, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. You might have saw some press on it recently. Actually, George W. Bush was the one who sort of pushed it forward. President Obama was the one who actually moved it over to the Senate. And we lost the vote in December. And what it basically would have done, and this is really sort of dumbing it down, right, is brought the ADA to the rest of the world, right? And it's really interesting because one of our policy advisors actually just spent a few months in Africa. She took a leave of absence from AAPD, and she came back and she's like, people love the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. They're excited about it. And we couldn't get it passed here because of a host of reasons, but I think we're going to be bringing it back up in February, and I'm feeling really good about our prospects this time.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Yeah, hi, my name, my son has epilepsy, and I suspect there's a stigma problem with that. Is there a stigma problem with disabilities as well that makes it difficult for people to come out and identify themselves as disabled? And what can be done to educate people about that it's an illness or it's a disorder or whatever it is, rather than being some sort of a personality or a serious chronic problem?
Right. Yeah, that's the challenge, right? That is the challenge, and it's a scary one, right? So one of the reasons why former Congressman Perriello got so involved in disability work, he was president of the student body, got great grades, was being recruited for all of these amazing jobs after he graduated, and a lot of the applications, right, asked if you had epilepsy at that time. And so he didn't want to lie. As he likes to say, he graduated from a Catholic college, and so right out in California. And so he checked the box. All of these people who had been actively recruiting him wouldn't even call him back, right? And so it is a challenge. And I really think that the more people sort of own it, the more they're going to realize that, oh, wait, it's no big deal. But it's tough, right? And so I was in a conversation with a leader, actually, in the disability space who happened to be bipolar. And we were going back and forth about whether you should disclose if you are bipolar. And she said, I would never in my life advocate for someone who is bipolar to come out in the workplace because they will lose their job. That's maybe true. But sort of drawing some parallels, right? If the LGBT community stayed in the closet, it wouldn't be where it is today, right? And so how do we remove that shame? How do we remove that stigma? It's a slow process. It's probably going to be painful. There probably will be people who lose their jobs. But in the end, that's what civil rights is, right? It's about pushing the barrier. It's about pushing the envelope and putting your own self-worth, your own equality before anything that anyone else has to say about you. And I think that is how we will make real change.
And that may be the exactly right note to end on.